Well, hello plant lovers. It is Matthew in Melbourne, welcoming you to my channel. Thank you very much for finding me in the crowded world of YouTube orchid videos. Here am I growing cold, cool, intermediate orchids here in Melbourne, Australia, without the help of greenhouses, grow lights, humidifiers, just me and them struggling inside or outside, or not at all. So plant lovers, if that sounds your bag, hit subscribe. I post every week and I am a complete amateur, so take everything I say with a grain of salt. And this week, yes, an array of beautiful flowering orchids. But how do we get to this point? It is spring in Australia, in the southern hemisphere, and the birds are tweeting that, well, not tweeting obviously because they can't anymore, they have to join, but they're twittering. And flowers are flowering and bees are buzzing, and generally everything's waking up after relatively long, coldish, dampish Melbourne winter, I must say. So I am very happy that spring has sprung. But what it does mean, of course, plant lovers, is tasks. So just as you sort of put things to sleep in autumn, thus you wake things up in spring. So this week, let's have a look at some of the things I need to do and perhaps should have done before, or perhaps might not even get around to doing every spring. The key things that I have to do every year to make sure that my orchids can end up blooming. But you know what, plant lovers? It is not all beer and skittles and flowering orchids here in my orchid world. Oh no, no, no. Every spring there is the very sad task of seeing who didn't make it through the winter. So just like the Oscars, a minor roll call of those who didn't make it in 2023. Because yes, it is easy to talk of one's triumphs on YouTube because that's kind of the point, isn't it? But I suppose there are also many, 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 many failures, some of which can be expensive, some of which can be embarrassing, and some of which can be upsetting as well because it's so obvious. Anyway, I thought I'd just show you a selection. Well, actually, no, these are, I think, mostly the things that this year did not make it through the winter. So this is like the Oscars, the roll call of our brothers and sisters in the performing arts who are no longer with us. So let me just move the living to make way for the dead, and we can have a little look at these plants and perhaps understand why they didn't make it. Oh, and this very large pot is, let's do this first because it's large and it's very, very sad. Look at the size of those pseudobulbs. Squishy as all hell, as you can see. And look at those little new growths, dead as a doornail. This was an amazing plant. Baccarara sea snake unforgettable, which I made a video about because I was also, yeah, it's great and I'm so good at looking after it. Exhibit A, one dead, very formally beautiful plant. Now, so the story with this is, it was one of the first orchids I ever bought, and it bloomed beautifully, and it's an Oncidium type from the Oncidium Alliance. It's quite a complex hybrid and relatively easy to get to flower, and it loved my conditions. But then, plant lovers, I got a bit complacent and I got more orchids, and this is quite large and it got to be a little tricky in terms of where to put it. And then really, Oncidium alliances don't do brilliantly outside all year for me. Some species Oncidiums can really take cold winter minimums, but most really don't like to go that low. So I do have to bring most of them in. Now, last winter, I just could not face trying to find a spot for this. So I thought, you know what? It's big enough. It'll manage outside. Well, it didn't. Compounded with that is that I had it sort of in a corner underneath something else that was dripping on it. So it got both wet and cold. So the new growths, unfortunately, immediately kind of rotted and died. The old growths, of course, long gone. So this Baccarara sea snake unforgettable is not forgotten. And in fact, it is such a beautiful orchid that I am going to order one again. And this time, plant lovers, I'm going to keep my eye on the ball and not kill it. So that's the first failure. Oh my goodness, this is perhaps not a great way to begin the video. There are lovely things coming, trust me. The other thing that I killed, well, let's have a look at this. This is quite a rare and unusual orchid, which I've killed. It is called Zelenkoa onusta. There we go. And it's kind of an Oncidium-like looking flower. Likes a dry winter rest, and I bought it at the beginning of winter. And it did have one active growth and then a lot of sort of dormant growth, but it just did not make it through the winter. And I think one of the things for this was that I just ordered it at the wrong time of year. So it arrived in deep midwinter, bare rooted, and just didn't like it, I don't think. That's my theory anyway. There is a little bit of green left on that one pseudobulb, but no, this is not going to give me anything. So this, unfortunately, Zelenkoa onusta is going into the compost bin. And joining it will be this. Oh my goodness me, this was such an expensive orchid, and it just pains me to actually have to admit it's dead. Cloacetum Panang Waltz, beautiful flower, and one of those kind of catasetum type of flowers. Plants, you know, goes into a hard dormancy in winter, sheds its leaves, you don't water it at all until you get new growths, which are quite large, the roots start to grow, then you start to, you have to repot it and then water it and feed it. Well, I have struggled with this type of orchid, and I try to find the sunniest, brightest, warmest spot in summer outside, and then as the weather begins to turn and they go into dormancy, I bring them inside onto a sunny windowsill to have cool but not cold but bright winter conditions while they are bone dry and dormant. Sounds good in theory, but this one I just bought in last autumn a little bit too late, and it got a bit wet and a bit cold and a bit damp, and the last year's pseudobulb got some rot on it. Anyway, I stopped the rot. However, that growth then produced this growth last year. And I thought, ah, there you go. I have solved it. I have saved the orchid. And it then produced this growth. Well, this winter, look, dead as a doornail. Can you see? So the rot obviously was deep within it, has re-emerged from the base of the pseudobulb. Yeah, that is dead as a doornail. Now, at this time of year, they should be producing their new spring growth, and this one really isn't because it's dead down there in the crown. So this expensive orchid is also going into the compost bin. Along with this, which was a brand new purchase, but this is the thing that makes me so cross. This is a Neostylus pinky. There you go, and there's the form. I mean, who really cares what it is because it's dead as a doornail. Now, the stupid thing is I bought this at an orchid fair in winter, and it is not an outdoor orchid. And I just put everything in a tray out by the back door, outside. I mean, bright, undercover, protected, but nonetheless getting coldish temperatures, thinking, right, I'll get to that. And, you know, a couple of nights later, hadn't got to it, and look at that. Krispy Kreme, cold, cold, cold and wet, killed it flat out. And I literally had only owned it a week. So that's that. Now the other thing, this is a fun thing because this is alive, as you can see, and this is dead, as you can also see. This is something that a few people have continually asked me about. Now I made a deflasking video probably 2 years ago now of Doritis pulcherrima, and it's a cross between a light and a dark color. Anyway, I bought myself a flask, had never deflasked before. But this is a sort of a Phalaenopsis type of orchid, and they're apparently the easiest to grow from flask. Now this plant, as you can see, look at that, healthy, going gangbusters, living its best life. And look at that one, turned to mush. Who knows why? In exactly the same spot, getting exactly the same conditions. So what I have experienced with this deflasking is that some of the plants just continue to thrive and thrive and thrive, and then about every 6 months, one of them just dies and turns into mush like this one. Isn't it curious? Anyway, all I want is one healthy plant out of that flask, because this is an orchid that you really do not find in Australia much at all. Now that one is looking very healthy, and there's a couple of other healthy ones as well. So that's all I really care about. Anyway, so this is like a partial death and partial survival, and maybe it's the survival of the fittest. And the last cab off our death rank is this. Look at that sorry specimen. Now I have had this as a seedling for years. When I first got into orchids and I had no idea what I was buying or doing, I just bought a ton of things and didn't really understand that seedlings can take years to mature and flower. I just madly bought things, even though they were probably highly unlikely to ever thrive or grow in my climate. But this was one of them, and it is a Brassicatleya hybrid called Morning Glory. Well, I have no luck with Cattleyas, nor have I ever grown Brassivola, so there you go. I think they just prefer warmer climates. Warmer climates, anyway. Look at that, dead, dead, dead. But I mean, I had it for years, and every year it would send out a growth, and it would start to do things. I think, oh, maybe this year it's doing its business, and I would bring it in the winter and give it plenty of light and plenty of water, plenty of love, and it would grow, and there'd be things going on. As you can see, it kind of got reasonably long leaves. And then, yeah, it's just dead. And you know what? I'm kind of grateful because I've been sick of carrying the burden of this orchid for years and years and years and it not doing anything. So I'm secretly relieved this one has died. Anyway, plant lovers, that is the end of our Oscar tribute to our artist friends who did not make it this year. All right, plant lovers, enough of death and dying. Let's go and celebrate life. So I'm going to head outside now and just show you some of the things I'm doing with my Cymbidiums. So out here is my Cymbidium bed, as it were, and where I keep both mature plants but also seedlings. And one of the things I do every spring is just check how my repotted seedlings go. Now, I made a video last spring about repotting Cymbidium seedlings, and this was one of them. And when I came to unpot it live, it had really bad roots. However, I used a stake to keep it upright, and what we can see here is, ta-da, a new growth, and it is really solid in that pot. So this seedling has done really well. Now, what I will just do is just topically apply slow release fertilizer, as I do with all my other orchids at this time of year. So all of these repotted ones, I just want to make sure they're basically in good health and have made it through the winter, made it through the wilderness, and are putting on their spring growth, which this one is. So from now on, I can start a regular-ish liquid feed as we get into the warmer parts of the year. And then the other thing to do is just to look at seedlings I've bought in the last 12 months, as it is now spring, perfect time to repot, and just have a look. Now this is a little seedling Cymbidium. This is Cariad Plush, which is an amazing flower. And I mean, I could leave it in this pot for the rest of the year until next spring, but I don't know, I'm just not feeling it's looking perhaps as perky and vibrant as I want. So I am in fact going to go and repot a few of these seedlings that I bought over the last 6 months. Now the other Cymbidium spring task is just to look at all of those that have bloomed, like this one here, trim off the dead spikes. This is one again that I bought over the last 12 months, and it's in a plastic pot, which I don't love. And what I'm going to do this spring, now, we actually don't have any new growth appearing yet, so it's kind of a good time to do it. The flower spike has just died. We've got some old leaves here. So I'm just going to take this out the back, trim off these old flower spikes, and repot this one and have a little look at what's going on inside, give it some fresh mix and a little bit of mycorrhizal fungi and some slow release fertilizer. And this is the spring task for Cymbidiums. So basically with the Cymbidiums, I just want to check that they're all in good health, trim off any of the dead flower spikes. I can see one there actually. And in fact, I've just noticed there's a species one here in bloom, which I can show you. Look at that. The flowers are just starting to come out. And there's another spike there. How fantastic. And I cannot find the tag. Oh my goodness, I'm gonna have to look through my records and see what it is, but I know it's a species, and look, 2 spikes, which is fantastic. Pretty late in the season, anyway. So this one is going back where it was, and nothing will happen to it until the flowers come out and I can take it and display them a bit more. But what I can see is plenty of new pseudobulb growths coming up here, which is fantastic to see. So once again, this will just get a good dose of slow release fertilizer, and I'm gonna pop it back. So spring means checking the Cymbidiums, seeing how they have traveled through the flowering season, find any that might need to be cleaned up, have the flower spikes removed, check if anything needs repotting, and check on the seedling. So spring is definitely a good time to repot. So this is the Cymbidium that was out the front, and the first thing is we can see that it has a cane to start with, which we don't need anymore, but also a spent flower spike. So what I'm going to do is just repot this one. And at this time of year, I'd be repotting, well, many things actually. It's a good idea just to check everything and see how they're going. So particularly things that you've had in pots for a couple of years, check on the medium, have a sniff. Is it smelling fresh and perky, or is it smelling a little bit rank and off? Often if the orchid's not looking super healthy as well, it's an indication that perhaps the medium isn't great or its roots aren't in great condition. So if you need to check, this is a great time of year to do it. And the weather's just beginning to warm up and the orchid is perhaps going into a growth phase, so putting out new roots, a great time to be repotting it. And if you have to check the roots, get it out of its medium, check, and then repot. Now is the time. So I'm going to swivel the camera and just do a quick repot of this Cymbidium. So this is a no ID Cymbidium hybrid, which I bought because the flower was fabulous. So let's just get it out of this pot and see what is going on. They can often, oh, there you go, that's quite easy. They can be quite tricky. So let's have a look. Now, often Cymbidiums have very, very vigorous root systems, but this one, plant lovers, really doesn't. And in fact, what we can see is a fairly brutal slicing there. So I think this one was only relatively recently divided. I'm quite surprised actually, not the most amazing root growth there. Anyway, I don't think there's really anything for me to trim off. I mean, there's lots of dead roots, but there's not really that much point trying to clean some of these out. I think we can just let nature take its course. That is a very woody base in there. Anyway, what I am going to do is just clean off this old flower spike down as low as you can. There we go. Here is our new fabulous terracotta pot, and if you wanted to drill holes in it, you certainly could, and I've made a video about doing that, which I will link. And what I do use for Cymbidiums, which might outrage you all, is just use out of the bag orchid mix. So this is, let's try and show you, this is quite it's quite a nice medium-y sized bark mix, but it does sort of have more peaty elements, so it is a bit grittier, a bit grainier, I think, than just using your own sort of bark mix. Now into that mix, with all repotted orchids, but it is also spring, I put slow release fertilizer, give it a bit of a perk up into its new surroundings, and also just a little dose of mycorrhizal fungi. There you go, just a little soupçon in there. Mycorrhizal fungi is present in all soils, and it has a symbiotic relationship with plant roots, in that the roots of the plant provide the mycorrhizal with energy through photosynthesis, and the mycorrhizal fungi provide the plant with nutrients from the soil and water. Okay, there is our Cymbidium, and we're just going to fill around. Now, Cymbidiums do like to be pot bound, so we are not really going up much of a size. So this orchid has plenty of room to grow, produce some new spikes for us. And you can see this is sort of where the old division was centered, and the plant is growing in that direction. So we've got plenty of space around the back, which is where hopefully all the new growths are going to be coming. Now, none of them have emerged as of yet, so hopefully in the next couple of weeks, we will start to see those coming out. There we go. Spring task complete. Now what I will do is just give this a watering with a diluted, and I've just got it here, seaweed-based solution, and I use this Australian brand called Sea Sol, and I dilute this to about 1/8 of the recommended dose on the bottle. And sea salt is a tonic, not a fertilizer, so it just helps the plant settle in, give it a bit of a lift. Now, the other thing at this time of year is to go and have a look at some Australian orchids, the Australian Dendrobiums and sarcochilus, because they're both doing different things at this time of year. Let's go and have a look. Now, the other thing I do out here, this sunny end of the area is where all, well, not all, but many of my Australian Dendrobiums are. So this is Dendrobium speciosum, and there are some speciosum hybrids and some Kingianum hybrids here. It's been a bit of a weird season. I've got a Kingianum hybrid in bloom over here. The speciosum is only just coming into bud, which is very strange. And the other Kingianums and Australian Dendrobiums are on the other side of the house. But what I do at this time of year is give them all a little dose of lime. Now, many of these plants are lithobites, or grow sort of in nooks in rocks where material has gathered, leaves and detritus, etc. And I met a grower at one of the orchid fairs who really recommended just giving them a small amount of garden lime every spring. So I literally use my seed dipper and I give about that much, about, I'd say 1/4 teaspoon of garden lime, once a year, every spring. The other spring task outside here in the growing area is just to have a look at sarcochilus. Now, I've made lots of sarcochilus videos and I love them. They're a really tough, easy Australian orchid to grow for me here in Melbourne. I know in other parts of the world they can be tricky. Trick is winter light. Anyway, I did go on a bit of a sarcochilus seedling buying binge over the last 12 months. A lot of them I repotted as well. Now, I have had issues with slugs and snails eating the flower spike. So one of the things I always try and remind myself to do is just check on the sarcochilus situation and the slug and snail situation. So my Hartmanii, which is just coming into spike over here, 2 years ago, at least half the flower spikes got eaten off by slugs or snails. Bitterly disappointed anyway, so I always just have a little look, and I try and use the iron-based slug and snail pellet. That's the pellet that isn't toxic to birds and other animals, so if an animal eats the dead snail, it's not going to die and be horribly poisoned, and those pellets break down to become a fertilizer. They're not as efficacious, however. They do take quite a bit of time to work, but if you kind of are pretty liberal in your application of them in your grow space, they do eventually control the slugs and snails. Anyway, this is the seedling that I potted up last year, and you never know if it is going to flower for you, but look at that. We have one spike here, which is fantastic, and it actually had flowered before. You can see there's a dead spike there from the season before, so no surprise there. But we do have a wonderful new fan which has emerged in the last 12 months. So this one's doing well. So what I'm going to do is just check all of the sarcochilus, make sure that there's no nibbling going on, and like everything else, these will get a topical dose of slow release fertilizer. And when the sarcochilus are all in bloom, I will do a follow-up video. But perhaps the most important thing in spring is fertilizing, feeding. Yes, everything's waking up. Well, not everything. Some things are, most things are. And at this time of year, perhaps putting on new growth, putting on new roots, creating new pseudobulbs, perhaps even generating flower spikes for some Oncidium types of orchids or Dendrobiums that are waking up as well. So this is the time of year to feed. So when I come out here in spring, it's often a little with trepidation and fear, because winters can be touch and go, and it can sometimes get quite cold. And it's always a question of, well, has everything survived? So one of the first things I might want to do is just check on some of the older things. And this is an interesting Oncidium alliance, and it's just got a couple of dead leaves, which is great. And this is an Oncidium montanum crossed with, oh, crispum. There we go. Hasn't bloomed for me yet, but just having a look at it, it is really, really healthy. Amazing new roots and amazing new growths. So I might well get blooms this year. Who knows? I bought this a year ago, actually. So the most important thing to do in spring for me is, with all of my orchids, give them a good, healthy dose of slow release fertilizer. Now, what I use is a pretty generic all-purpose fertilizer, and I get a 6-month release one, because you can get slow release fertilizers that release over 12 months, but that's not great for orchids because many of them certainly slow down in autumn and only begin to perk up in spring. So you really don't want to be feeding them for that in-between period of time. You kind of want to maximize all the food in the warmer growing periods. Asterisks, there are some things that are dormant and then some things that grow all year. So generally with the orchids that do most of their growing work in the warmer periods of the year, a healthy dose of slow release fertilizer, and things that are growing throughout winter, I will give them a liquid fertilizer irregularly and quite weak and diluted all throughout the year. But in spring, one of my key tasks is to give everything a good feed. And I don't use a huge amount, maybe that much, not a huge amount, just sprinkle it around. And if you've got orchids with roots that are very visible on the surface, try not to get the pellets too close to the roots, because as the fertilizer is released, and this sort of slow release is activated by warmth, by temperature, you don't want a burst of food and nutrient around the roots because it can sometimes damage them. So just be a little wary about where you are putting slow release fertilizer when you're sprinkling it madly across your orchids. The other thing in spring is to start having a look at your Dendrobiums. Now this one is a Dendrobium legicii, which is an interesting form. I've made a video about this before. It's an odd growth habit in that it develops all of these sort of tangled keikis, and it forms just a mound of keiki and plant, which when I first started to grow it panicked me, because I thought, it's not happy. It's either getting too much water or not enough light, and it's keikiing madly. But that's the habit it does. Now, this orchid for me generally blooms at Christmas. So we're in September now, October, November, December. We've still got 3 months to go. And I am just having a look and I cannot see any signs of flower buds. Now this is something that I keep dry all winter. However, it is now warming up. Even though there are no flower buds, I'm going to start watering this because I think I can see some new growths just emerging at the bottom, and some of those keikis are looking a little bit desiccated and dehydrated. So it is time to start gently ramping up the water on this baby and any other dendrobiums that have had a really dry winter. Now is the time to have a look and just start watering them. Now spring is also terrestrial time, well often, and it's a good time to just check up on terrestrials. Now here I've got a beautiful peony. This yellow one is Peony Shantung Canberra, named after Australia's capital. Isn't that beautiful? And this one, which is just coming over now, is Peony Tongariro. Now, one of the things you can see is that the flowers are going over, but if I put this one down, what we see here is that our leaves are beginning to appear out of the bulb and the dying flower head. So now is the time to really start ramping up the watering and liquid fertilizing of, well, peonies, particularly terrestrial orchids, because they put on all of this vegetative growth. Now at this time of year, they'll produce quite large fleshy leaves, which need to do lots of photosynthesizing and energy production to start bulking up new bulbs to give you new flowers in seasons hence. So now is the time to start watering them more fully, because you have been keeping them a little dryish over winter until the flowers have emerged and bloomed. Now is the time then to start really kicking in, watering and liquid feeding your peonies. And more terrestrial orchids. Look at this. This is the most fabulous calanthe, and this one is called Aristulifera. I think this is a Japanese one. It's a stunning, stunning orchid. Look at that. And what I always want to do is just check on how they're going. You see, remove all these fallen leaves that are around it. Now, these munched leaves are last year's leaves, so what I'll be doing is trimming those off. Again, like everything, giving it a topical slow-release fertilize, and just making sure that after its basically abandonment out in the garden all winter, that it's firing on all cylinders and looking as healthy as possible. Again, you've got to watch for slugs and snails. This is last year's damage. The new leaves, as you can see, are pristine. So my slug management program is really working. I'm just weeding out little grass seedlings on this too. So a good time of year to check on terrestrial orchids, which are probably doing their thing and needing a little bit more of your attention. Now, another spring task is to come to the, well, actually halfway up the stairs, as Kermit said, to look at things that go into a hard dormancy over winter. Now, these are all those sort of catasetum type of orchids, and this is actually a Fred Clarkiara type, and it's After Dark Baker's Black Hole. Goodness me, there's a poetic name. Now, I've had, plant lovers, no success with this type of orchid here in Melbourne. And I actually don't think I've ever seen one in bloom here in Melbourne at an orchid show or in a shop. So maybe I'm in zonal denial and they are never going to flower. But my, I'm going to say New Year's resolution, a new growing year's resolution as we're coming into spring, is to really try hard with these. Now, the thing about spring with this type of orchid is that they've gone into a hard dormancy. So the pseudobulbs shed all their leaves, you withhold watering completely, which is very hard for someone like me who is such a giver, and wait until the new growths emerge. So you can see this one here is quite tall. I would say that's about 4 inches, so maybe about 7 centimeters, and pretty much getting up to the size where we're going to start to want to fertilize and begin watering again. Now, what I can't see in there is how big the roots are, but you want the roots to be a reasonable length before you start really getting into the watering. So I'm going to wait just a little bit longer until this is a little bit bigger and then really get into heavy feeding, heavy watering. And this plant, or this new growth, is deriving all its nourishment from last year's old pseudobulb. So that's how it can look so perk and greeny when the pot is as light as a feather and as dry as dust. I'm determined to give these a good Aussie go this year. So this is a north-facing window. I'm in the southern hemisphere, so that means it's the brightest part of the house. In the northern hemisphere, it will be a south-facing window. So they're getting bright, bright light all winter. Now in summer, when it really warms up, I'll take them outside so they get really, really hot and really bright, intense light. We'll see how we go. Anyway, spring is a time to see if these have woken up, and all of mine have. to varying degrees. This one, which is called Midnight Lace, which sounds like an 80s mini-series, has only just started to shoot there, as you can see. I had a little bit of rot issue last time. I'm still getting it right. Actually, that was 2 years ago. I left them outside a little too late in the year, brought them in autumn, but had got them a bit cold and wet, so there was rot on that bulb, which I managed to stop. We had a new bulb last year, and we have another one here. So let's see how I go with that one. And this one is After Dark SVO, and this is even further back, and what you can perhaps just see in there is the tiniest of green shoots just coming out. So this one is just beginning to come out of its dormancy. So each of these three I will start watering at a different time, because I've got to wait for that growth to be quite big and those roots to really start developing before I start watering and feeding and or repotting. Let's see how we go with these on their sunny spot this year. So there we are, plant lovers, Spring 101. It is a great time of year. There is lots to have a look at, lots to celebrate, and as we saw, some things to mourn and say farewell to. But you know, growing orchids is a learning curve, because even if you really know what you're doing, which I don't, you can still just find the seasons are different or a plant does something you don't expect. Which is why it's great to join clubs and to find other people who are growing orchids, because the more knowledge you can acquire, the better off you are to not make some expensive mistakes like I have. But anyway, it's a wonderful time of year. I've been a bit reluctant to actually even go outside because it's been so cold and miserable. So I'm really excited now to start diving in and making sure I'm kind of looking after things in the best way. Anyway, plant lovers, if you're in the southern hemisphere going into spring, lucky us, isn't it going to be a gorgeous time? And if you're in the northern hemisphere going into autumn, well, that's a beautiful time of year too. Very, very atmospheric and beautiful. So wherever you are, I hope your orchids are thriving, as are you. And I look forward to seeing you next week on Friday. So hit subscribe if you want to know what I might be doing. See you then.